Hey guys, Jae Wilson here from Onyx Reporting. Today we're going to take a look at how you can explore the permissions API in Domo to get a list of all of the users who have access to a data set. Now you guys know how it is. You create a data set in Domo that's got some sensitive information. You build a dashboard off of it. You want to share it with other people, but you want to make sure that that sensitive information stays secure. So some clients I've worked with will create a copy of the data set that has the sensitive data removed, build a copy of the dashboard on it, and then they just have to manage who has access to which dashboard. This is an okay solution. It gets the job done, but you have to remember to include PDP. And this is where some clients get themselves in trouble. PDP is the only tool, personalized data permissions, is the only tool for really making sure that you don't accidentally share data with the wrong person. If you don't enable PDP, just assume eventually the whole world or everyone in your instance of Domo is going to see that data. Um, I literally had a client that I was working with where they had this two data set solution and someone shared the wrong card with the wrong person, and all of a sudden the wrong people were seeing salaries and personal information. No good. Enable PDP. I've already done a tutorial on enabling PDP dynamically, but let's talk about how to monitor permissions and who has access to a data set. Now, in the data center, you can go here into shared data set, and I can see all of the people who have access to my data set, which is good. But it's annoying because if you go into the admin section and look at people, if I look at Bard, I cannot see all of the data sets he has access to. I can see the groups, the pages and cards he has access to, but not the individual data sets. So if I wanted to know, what all which data sets a user has access to, we don't have that in Domo. Fortunately, in this tutorial, we're going to learn how to build a data set like this. This is kind of like your DomoGovernance or Domo Stats data set, insofar as if I knew that Bard's username was or user ID was this, I would be able to filter my list and say, okay, here are all of the data sets that this user has access to, or in this case, this group has access to. Cool. That's what we're going to learn how to do. Let's get to it. Well, the first thing I need to understand is like if I want to know permissions of a data set, what API do we have to hit? We've done this a couple times in my tutorial series. We're going to right click, inspect, pop over to the network tab, go to that user interface of interest, and just see what the UI does. So here I've got my permissions API. I can see that I'm querying the dataset data sources permission API. I'm running a GET request. GET, ideally, I would expect to list out or get the permissions here. If I change the permissions, I hit that same API, but this time I have a put request. And in my put, I'm sending the body, or I'm sending what access level Bard should have. And you can see here it's different. It's from edit. It should now be can share. Yeah. Okay. So we know we're going to hit that API. We've talked about this a ton. Where is it? Permissions. With my permissions API, I'm going to use that XDomo authentication. If I can run my GET request, now I can see I can get a list of the people who have XYZ level of access. Okay, now here's a challenge with like trying to do automation. When you think about automation, it helps to kind of break it down into the individual tasks that we need to accomplish if we were trying to do this by hand. So if I want to get for all of the data sets in my data center, I want to know their permissions, and then I want to upload a data set. Okay, well, what are the pieces? Well, one, I have to query the data center and say, give me a list of all my data sets. Then, for each data set, I need to loop over each data set and ask what are the permissions for that data set. Cool. I collect that data, shape it into the right shape, and then I want to upload that data into Domo. Now, if I don't have a data set that it's going to, I need to create a new data set. And then once I've created that data set, I have a data set ID, and now I can push my data into that data set. Those are the tasks. It's quite a lot to get through, so let's get to it. All right, so here's my index.js. You can see here we're recycling some code. I've already talked about using environment variables for storing username and passwords and all of that stuff, so I'll link that tutorial video below. Notice, though, if you've been watching the other tutorials, I'm now using Domo Client and Domo Secret in addition to username, password, and instance. And I'm doing that because I'm going to have to do a different authentication method. Previously, we've done authentication against public APIs that are not documented, and I call that full authentication. We've used the full authentication workflow, again, that I've talked about in previous tutorials, but now we're also going to get into developer.domo.com APIs, which are public documented APIs, and they have a different authentication pattern that we're going to use. Cool. So let's take a look at how my Domo authentication function has changed. Notice, instead of sending each of the parameters individually, I've adopted this method where I have a config object that I'm just stuffing all of it into. All right, so let's take a look at Domo auth. So off the bat, we import one object called config, and then we destructure the variables of interest. The reason why I'm taking this approach is if I were to call Domo auth function, but not pass in username or password, my code will still run, but these variables would be undefined, not null, not empty string, just undefined. But it wouldn't break any of my code. Now, again, I have two sets of authentication that I'm going to run through. I'm going to do my full authentication, where I'm authenticating against your instance of Domo API content v2 authentication. For this, just like we've done in the past, we send in our username and password as part of the body of the request. Okay, let's call that normal or full authentication. We've done that before. The new authentication method is against api.domo.com. And here we pass a client ID and secret as part of the authorization header. And so basically what we're going to do here is instead of sending your client ID and secret in plain text, we encode it in base 64. So I'll leave the screen up here a little bit so you can kind of look through it. But again, the idea is this time the authentication is being sent through my headers as opposed to my body. And I'm authenticating against api.domo.com, again, as opposed to previously we were authenticating against your instance of Domo. All right, that part's all sorted out. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to return one object that contains the session token and developer token. The session token is what we've been doing all this time. The developer token is that token that we're going to use against the public documented APIs. Cool. So that's the update to the Domo auth function. And then here you can see when I get my response, I'm destructuring session token and developer token as two separate variables. What that looks like when you run your data flow. Do I have it? Oh, because I'm let me see. Can I show you the results? Hold on. Somewhere in here, I console log return Domo. No, that's under my utils function. Give me a sec here. Okay, so here you can see that the session token and developer token get returned as one object, which I then destructure into two separate variables. Cool. So with that authentication done, now I can go ahead and say, hey, I want to get all of the data sets out of the data center. Again, the process is the same. Monitor network traffic and then see what happens. So when I go to my, where's the data center? When I go to the data center, I can see here we run a search query. We send a post request Notice this is northshore.io.partner, so I'm using I'm using the session token, not the developer token. And then with this post, I'm sending a body. And in this body, I'm saying, what are the filters that I want? How many data sets do I want to return? Do I have some sort of offset or a sort order? Cool. Let's take a look at that search data center function. Notice here I'm passing just the URL and my session token. All right, where are we going? Demo utils. Okay, to search the data center, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a loop where I collect all of the data sets. I could have 50, 1,000, or 10,000 data sets in my data center. And to keep my API from dying, I'm going to say, hey, when I run my query, I just want you to return 100 data sets at a time and just loop until we get to the end. Now, how do I know when I'm at the end? How do I know? When you hit that API, it gives you a metadata object that says, hey, the limit is whatever I pass in, and my total count is, however many data sets are in my data center. And if I set my offset to 0, 5, 10, or 500, whatever, that's where it's going to start counting the next 30 data sets. So this metadata object is going to help us in our loop. So I'm going to declare my initial variables here, and I'm basically going to say while is_loop is equal to true, keep on going through this pattern. So I'm going to get data from this API, and then again I've altered my get data function to receive 1, 2, 3 arguments. The 3 arguments being what's my URL, what method, post, put, get, and then a config object. Okay, so in this case, my configuration object will have a token, which is my session token, the body, which will be what my filter request is, and the type will say, am I doing the full authentication or the developer authentication pipeline? Okay. So we'll go through the get data in a moment, but let's assume that I get back a object that contains an array called data sources. What I need to do is here I'm saying, hey, if I get an object with a key value pair called data sources, then just add it to my existing variable called query response.datasources. Also, I want to add the metadata that came back in my query, my Domo query, onto this object. And what I'm going to use that for is so that at the end of the day, I can know how many data sets I have, and I can confirm that I got all of them. Now, I'm going to loop through this, right? So my offset needs to be equal to however many rows I pulled back. So if I pulled down 12 data sets in my last API request, then my offset needs to be offset plus 12 to get the next 12. I hope that makes sense. It's just a basic loop. If you don't understand looping, well, again, that's something you can Google. But let's take a look at how this get data function has changed, because we've seen this in other tutorials I've run, but again, I've modified the code. So with get data, again, the arguments I'm expecting are the URL, the method, and the configuration object. I'm going to destructure token, type, body, and content type. Again, when I call get data, I may or may not include a body. I may or may not include content type. Now I have to have content type. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, if you send content type, then it's content type. But if you didn't send content type, then set content type equal to application JSON. So basically I'm saying this is my default value. And that's the code you use for default value for a variable. Okay, now the token type is going to tell you, The type is going to tell me if I'm using the developer authentication method or that full authentication method. If I'm using developer, then I have to add a header called authorization. If I'm using full authentication, I have a header called xdomo authentication. Okay, so two different authentication methods and two different ways of passing the token. And this is all based off of the documentation. If you pop over into developer.domo.com and you go to, I think, API reference, nope, API overview, sorry. If you go to developer.domo.com, API overview, and take a look at the API authentication flow, they kind of talk you through how you set how you handle authentication using any of the APIs that start with api.domo.com, which is net new from the tutorials you've seen from me so far. Okay. Again, I'm trying to have one function, get data, that can support both methods. And so that's why we're building this config object and adding a little bit more flexibility to my code. Now, for the body, if I'm sending JSON, sorry, if I have a JavaScript object, to convert it into JSON, I have to run JSON stringify body. But if I'm just sending plain text, then I can just pass in the body object because presumably I've passed in plain text. So again, this is just code I've built in to kind of extend the get data function. All right, back to my index. Search data center, pass in Domo instance, pass in my session token. And so I know I'm going to do full authentication. And what do I get back? I get back an array containing all of the data sets. If I were to log this, okay, when I log this, I need to do it before we start adding on our permissions. Okay, at the time when I initially log all data sets, it doesn't have, oh, sorry, I should have done it up here. When I send all data sets, I don't have the permissions of that data set. It's not part of the response. So what I can do is I can say, hey, for each data set in all data sets, I want you to get the permissions for that data set. So what I end up doing is I call another function called dsPermissions, where I pass in the dataset ID and I tell it to get permissions. Now you might notice here I'm using promise.all. If you're not familiar with promises, go ahead and Google that too, but it's kind of related to this async await that we've been talking about. If you'll recall, an asynchronous action or an asynchronous function is one where I don't know how long it's going to take me to get a response. If you think about all of your APIs, I could take 2 seconds or 20 seconds to get a response from the API. Now, if I'm mapping or looping over the data sources in all data sets, I could have 50 or 100 asynchronous requests that I'm waiting on, right? So what promises.all does is it says, hey, wait until all of these promises, until all of these API requests are resolved before moving on to the next step. And basically what we're doing is here, I'm going to get an object called permissions back from this function, and then I'm going to return the data set and the permissions for that data set. That's my goal with this block of code here. For each data set, return the data set and the permissions associated with it. So let's take a look at this dsPermissions. What dsPermissions does, and we looked at this in Postman already, is it says, hey, get data, which we've talked about just now, hit this API. So data sources, pass in my data set ID, and hit the permissions API. I can use this API to get the current set of permissions, or theoretically I could put and change the existing permissions if I passed in a body argument. So we're going to say, hey, I'm running get data. Here's my token. It's a session token. The body is whatever got passed in. I didn't pass in a body, so this will be undefined in my current implementation. And the type is I'm using that full authentication pipeline. Cool. And then I'm going to return response.list. If you recall from Postman, when I ran and hit the permissions API, it returns an object here that contains list, which has all of my permissions, and then some metadata, the number of users. I only want to return this block here, which is why I'm returning response.list. And that's what tacks the permissions array onto the dataset object. If I were to stop there, we'd be in a good place. We're like, hey, I know how to get descriptive information about a data set as well as the permissions object. But what I want to do is I want to put that into Domo as a like data governance or a Domo governance data set. So the next set of steps are to, one, I need to create a data set, and then I need to put or update the data that I just pulled into Domo. So how do we go about doing that? We'll start with, and now we're down here. Okay, so we're going to start by confusing myself. Oh, damn it. Sorry, guys. Okay, we're going to start by creating a data set. I could do this like manually, like using the Java CLI, but I wanted to be able to do this in code. So I created a function called dataset. I'm going to pass in the developer token. Remember, developer token hits api.domo.com. And this is why we had to do all of that extension and modification of my auth function, is specifically because now we're starting to hit developer.domo.com. I've designed my DS dataset function to have different code that executes based off of the action that I ask you to run. So I can send the action of create or update schema or update data. And we'll see how that works. As part of the config object, we're also going to pass in a body or what do I want you to do. So in this case, I want you to create a new data set that has this schema. Let's take a look at my DS dataset function. Again, it receives developer token, a config object. I destructure action schema data and dataset ID off of the config object. Anything that was not defined will be undefined. Cool. So here's where I'm able to run different bits of code depending on the action. So in this case, I say, if the action is equal to create, then I'm going to run this block of code. If the action is equal to update schema, I'll run that block of code. So what are we doing? We're calling get data. I'm passing in the datasets API, and I'm going to post. Now I have another config object. Remember, I'm sending this to get data, and I'm using the developer pipeline, and my body will be the schema that I just defined here. And this code will create a data set, and the response will be the new dataset ID. Okay, but once a data set has been created, I don't need to run that code again. Maybe I'll update the data set and change the schema or change the name of the data set. Maybe I'll upload data and actually change the data that's contained in that data set. So I actually went from wanting to have a data set that just had 4 columns, data set ID, people type, ID, and access level, to wanting to add a column for the name of the data set. So I needed to have an update schema function. And again, you can see it's got the same arguments, only this time I don't have to create a data set. I already have one. So now I need to pass the data set ID. By the way, guys, this has been a lot of fun because I'm like, oh, This is how the Java CLI works. You just take a little bit of code and extend it a little bit. Then you take that same code and then you just modify it slightly and add some more flags or parameters to it. It's been a blast. In any event, let's take a look now at my update schema. Okay, if I want to update my schema, again, I'm still running get data over this URL, but this time I have the dataset ID that I want to impact, and I run a put command. Again, guys, for this one, Domo actually does have documentation on the dataset API, so I'm not like, making any of this up. I'm not monitoring the browser. I'm actually looking at the documentation. It says, hey, if you want to update a data set, you run a put request against this API, and these are the things that you can include in the body. Okay, so I went ahead and defined or update my schema. Cool. Once my schema has been updated, I don't really need to run that code anymore, so fine, whatever. Last thing I want to do is I actually want to update my data. So I need to define a good body. Remember, importing data into a data set, this API only will receive data in CSV format. So text that's comma separated, and each row is a new line. Okay. This was a little bit of a trick to get done because currently all of my data is arranged in this object. And the nice thing about JSON objects or JavaScript objects is usually I'll just have a key and then the value. But sometimes I can have a key and an array of objects. Or I could have a key that has an object, and that object could have multiple values or multiple key value pairs, a nested object. That's really the power of a NoSQL database or a document-driven database like MongoDB, is I don't have to arrange everything into rows and columns and single value columns like we do in Domo. So my next challenge was to organize this into a structure that Domo will accept. And so what I did is I said, hey, take my all data sets. And for each data set, I need one row with 5 columns. The data set ID, the name, and then from the permissions array, the permission type, permission ID, and the access level. So in order to do that, I took the all datasets object, I reduce it. What reduce it means is if I were going to do a map, right? I would loop over all data sets and I would return an array. But if I reduce all data sets, what it does is it says return one object. Now the object I happen to be returning is also an array, but what the reason why I went with reduce is because within the data set itself, when I get to the permissions key value pair, the permissions is also an array. So I need to map over that array. I'm sure I'm losing you. Permissions is this array here, and I need to turn this into like the base of my data set. So for each object in this array, I need to say, hey, what's my data set ID, and then return this information. And so I can use the reduce function on the all datasets array to get that done. I feel like I'm doing a terrible job of explaining it, but that's how we're restructuring our data to go from having a nested set of arrays into just one array with this reduce method. When I finally hack the data into the right shape, I then call update dataset, update data, which I pass into get data, this time running a put with URL dataset ID / data, and I'm putting the data, but now I have to transform this array, which is technically a JavaScript data type, and I need to convert it to a text into a CSV. And so I have a utility function called array to CSV, and it receives my array. And I have a binary column is include headers, which is a default of false. And so what I say is I map over each object in my data array, and each object in that array will be a row. All right, hold on. Let me get down here. Each object in the array will be a row. And then I only want to keep the values, objects.values in an array. So if I have something like, let me see if I can't print it for you. I need to print, yeah, I need to print all data sets. Oh, let me just print the first one. Okay, so when I run object.values, what it does is it says, take an object, and then just keep the values in an array. So I would have an array with this value, then comma, that value, comma, that value, comma, that value. So I would have an array of just the values and not the keys. And that's my result called CSV. And technically, we're just about there. If I take CSV and then join all of the arrays with new line, now I've just got a string of all of the rows of my data organized like you would expect in a normal CSV file. Now I added the ability to include headers. And what this does is it says, hey, at this point, CSV still is an array where each row represents just the values. If I want to have a header as the first row of my data set, I'm going to insert object.keys. So object.keys would say, hey, here's my object. The keys are ID, display, data provider type, name, and owner. Those are the keys. And I'm going to put that at the start of my array before I do my join into normal text. And now that has that headers and then all of the rows of information, like you expect in a normal CSV file. Okay, that's pretty much it, right? That's the body that I send into dataset. And again, when I'm updating data, I'm hitting this API, I'm passing this body that has been cleaned up as a CSV. And the content type is not application JSON, but text CSV. Guys, we covered a lot. We really did. But, you know, I hope you found this interesting and useful, right? I showed you not only how to monitor network traffic to see the permissions, and I set you up because now that you know how to get permissions, you theoretically also know how to put a put that could alter the permissions on a data set. You could use the techniques that I just showed you to say, hey, I want to find a list of all of the data sets that are owned by XYZ user and replace the owner, which is something that I saw in the Domo Dojo, which was the inspiration for this tutorial. So, Ashley, I hope you got to the end of this because now I've just given you the solution. Not only how to generate a Domo governance data set, but also to how to dynamically change the owners of every asset that belongs to a certain person. My name is Jae Wilson. I'm a freelance consultant through my company, Onyx Reporting. Guys, this is the kind of stuff that I get excited about, is like how we can actually leverage these APIs to do something that you can't do in the Domo UI. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at jae@onyxreporting.com. I'll catch you later.